Well, thanks very much indeed. And the first thing I'd like to explain is that this is what I'm presenting to you today is what I want to do next. What I'm currently doing is building a framework to pursue a history that will begin in 2018. So the current project that I'm working on is Engineering Life, and this is also informing the way in which I want to currently explore writing different kinds of history. So I'm really excited to be able to be part of a conference like this, where we're taking the opportunity to be as reflexive as possible about how to combine environmental history and history of technology. So within Engineering Life, we're looking at contemporary science, we're looking at biological engineering, and in particular we're focusing on synthetic biology. So this explains a little bit about my perspective, is that I'm concerned about things that perhaps many of you don't have to be worried about, because I'm concerned more than ever before than about how my histories end up being interpreted by other people. So, because of that consciousness, rather than write in a way that maintains and perpetuates much of this current discourse on science, technology, the environment, food security, and the economy, I want to develop histories that interrupt and challenge much of that received wisdom. So with my pre-circulated paper, I told you that I want to achieve this by adopting the position that plants can and should be investigated and analysed as technologies. So rather than repeat all of that in my paper, I want to convince you of its usefulness, and the best way that I could think of to do that is by using all your work against you. So what I'll be doing is taking all the work, as much of the work as I could, that was pre-circulated, and then complementing it with two current case studies that I'm working on. So one case study that I'm currently working on is in collaboration with Paolo Palladino on the long history of sheep breeding, and the other the other case that I'm starting to put together is what I want to end up eventually doing when 2018 rolls around, which is the history of the potato from 1900 to the present in Britain. So I'll be using your stuff and then complementing it with what I've started to put together. And it's a good time to be doing this, because apparently I've heard that the time is ripe to be making new histories of things like organisms that combine in new ways environmental history and history of technology. There you go. I've always wanted to do that, never had a chance.
Take a picture of you.
Right, so what I would say to begin with is that some notion of improving or adding value was central to many of our techno-environmental histories. And I was excited to see how often engineers or engineering came up, whether in the sense of engineering landscapes, as in John's synthetic overview, the Army Corps of Engineers in Ralph's, or in Isa's paper, which unfortunately we haven't heard today. We won't hear today, but I would urge everyone who has access to it on Dropbox to give it a look. In her paper on 18th and 19th century bogland improvement in Ireland. Her emphasis on the broad ambitions of the project and the engineering expertise that went into them, I take as significant for environmental history in a number of ways. Firstly, as part of the current project that I'm on, Engineering Life, my colleagues Jane Calvert and Pablo Schifter have hammered home to me the need to take engineering on its own terms. Recognising, therefore, how much of the UK has been subject to the efforts of engineers is an opportunity to take engineers and engineering seriously as a distinct domain of expertise and as a profession. Here, then, in the pursuit of techno-environmental histories, we can give something back to broader HPS and STS in a way that I think is really adding value. We also heard about an emphasis on maintenance. And this is a line of research that's currently being pursued particularly in exciting ways over in the States through the maintainers.org, which I recommend you all go and have a look at. Lots of interesting work from people like Lee Vinsel and Patrick McRae looking at the role of maintenance and often engineers in that. But I also want to flag up there something that we might want to talk about, which is that are there ways in techno-environmental histories where an emphasis on maintenance is actually going to end up forcing out or overlapping with or competing with existing frameworks that we wouldn't necessarily want to get rid of? And I'm thinking in particular of the idea of stewardship, which has been developed over a number of decades of research in a range of different fields. Do we in our celebration of maintenance, we need to think about what is maintenance doing to ideas of stewardship, and we probably want to resist an amalgamation of the two ideas. Anyway, so the second significance that I see in Ace's paper is that it shows that we, as in the UK, have been dealing with improvers for a very long time, and that improvers always feel that there is more that they could do only if they weren't frustrated by circumstances, finance, or the burdens of politics. And the last thing I'd like to point out that overlaps with Isa's paper and my own work so is that the same figure of Arthur Young, with designs on improving the land in Ireland, in her paper, also features amongst a cast of others implicated in the history of UK sheep breeding that Paolo Palladino and I are currently collaborating on. We are looking at the demise and eventual revival of the Norfolk horn sheep, which you can see a picture of here. So at the very same time at which the work that Issa was talking about to do with the improvement of bogs in Ireland, similar arguments were being made about this sheep. People were arguing that it needed to be improved. Now, in this context, improved is kind of a euphemism because what it actually meant was exterminated. Arthur Young and others like him, in particular Thomas Coke of Norfolk, who was a friend of Arthur Young's and another great improver of the time, wrote in 1808 that the Norfolk horn should be eradicated, the most worthless race of animals that ever existed. And indeed, the breed was left to go extinct, or very nearly, as around the turn of the 20th century there's something like less than 15 left in the UK. So we have been dealing with improvers for a long time. Their motivations have always been revealing regarding the evaluation of environmental features, and if you end up being part of that environment that it is evaluated poorly, improvement might mean the end of you. Nation states played a key role in many of our techno-environmental histories, including, as we've just heard from in Jim's paper, about the various different countries involved in supplying the UK soap industries, the global power politics in Simone's, or in Matt Holmes's work, which you've just heard from, in which he did mention in the paper how many UK plant varieties actually came from overseas. And in his case, he was talking about Mexico and Peru for potatoes. This allows us to make the important point that so much of the UK's environmental history has been brought to it from outside. So think of the immigrant labour that's gone into building territories at home and abroad, the networks of expertise spanning the globe. Much of the UK's environment has, as a fact of the matter, been imported. In agriculture, for example, in the first half of the 20th century, most new cereal varieties actually came from breeders all across Europe. These breeders, who we can see as improvers, or perhaps, if we stretch the definition of engineer a little bit, as plant engineers, sent varieties and breeding material all around the world. Today we see the international circulation of plant germplasm, the inherent value of that material, as requiring further scrutiny, because many of those countries, like the UK, who have benefited the most from this exchange, have contributed the least to that very same biodiversity. So international arrangements such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol now attempt to make these arrangements more equitable, and there you might call it eco-bureau-euro criticism. The potato, as Matt mentioned, is a prime example of this, with many of the UK's most successful varieties, which were bred in the UK, but actually came from stocks overseas. This brings me to the other strand of my research, which is putting together a 20th and 21st century history of the UK, taking as my focal object the potato. So at the start of this history stands the figure of Redcliffe Nathan Salomon, one of the UK's and the world's first geneticists, and someone who published the first article on human genetics in what was the then new Journal of Genetics at the turn of the 20th century. Salomon was a great improver of the potato, and he did so on behalf of the British state, with the aim of making us stronger and able to supply our own varietal needs so that we would not have to rely on imports. And here I'm building on a line of research that Beres Charnley's most recently pursued to do with the Imperial Agricultural Project and the role of the scientists within it. Here then, the UK's environment is a productive space, one directly wedded to national, economic, and what today is called food security. I'll unpack more of Salomon in the UK's techno-environmental history as I go on. Suffice to say, nation and other nations matter in our histories. The need for and possible destruction of beauty was a common theme in much of our work. Michael's remarkable story of the Nightingale song broadcast over interwar radio, the middle classes clashing over the proper way to enjoy a drive through the countryside in Thames, or indeed the need to be surrounded by natural beauty to fully benefit from Jen's compressed air bath. Part of our techno-environmental history, therefore, does a job of accounting for environmental value, and this accounting takes place in many ledgers, not just those of productivity and efficiency, but this makes them no less practical. It really was the case that to get better in an air bath, you needed for your health the pure air and those rolling hills. We need to look for all the ways people responded to landscape and its change if we're going to construct a place in these histories for technology. I hinted at this in my paper with regard to James Purden's work on artistic responses to the arrival of the pylon across the UK. Here instead, I want to tell a story about the First World War, and a man evacuated from Belgium and brought to the UK. He was moved to a village just outside Cambridge, and there he took to painting the Cambridgeshire countryside. This is not his painting, by the way. This is a very famous painting by Paul Nash. This is to set the scene. Keep it in mind. Cambridge, he took to painting the Cambridgeshire countryside, perhaps drawn in by its beauty, or perhaps because parts of it reminded him of Belgium, or simply because painting something, anything, was a way of thinking past the violence taking place on the other side of the Channel. I do not know, but I do know he was in good health and around 6 foot tall. How do I know this? Because my potato man, before he ended up refashioning himself as a geneticist just before the war, Salomon had been a practicing doctor. Though when he himself contracted tuberculosis, he gave up the practice. However, with the outbreak of the Great War, too ill to fight, Salomon ended up going back to medicine in order to make his contribution by visiting enlistment posts, acting as the medical officer, signing men off as fit to fight. It was on one such trip to a village enlistment post that Salomon saw Al Belgian painting the English countryside, which he then wrote into a letter. That letter was sent to the War Office, advising that this evacuee, spending so much time painting, was clearly very healthy, and urging that he be immediately enlisted to fight in the Belgian army. The beauty of a landscape is not just something the rural or city folk fight over, as we heard about particularly in Tim's paper, but can also be something fatal. This story features in my techno-environmental history, first because it tells us something more about the First World War, which is a key area of focus for the history of science, and one that keeps almost becoming a key feature of what lots of people are working on at the moment. But also because it tells us about Salomon the geneticist, potato breeder, the improver, who's British, interested in beauty, national health, eugenics and genetics, which all go together in the modernisation of UK agriculture. Though as this is something that I've already written about elsewhere, I can just pass that on to you, or if you're interested in hearing more, I can talk to you about it during questions. Lastly, as I told you in my paper, the development of plants as technical objects takes many forms. So David's paper on the agricultural display at the Science Museum helps us tell much of that story. So too Thomas's on the economic imaginaries that seem to demand one set of arrangement for national resources rather than another, one kind of potato, one that's particularly productive rather than another. But we also eat our environment. It is not just plant life that we learn about through pursuing techno-environmental history, but what is considered good living. I want to end by taking Jessica's paper on the place of asbestos in our improved British beautiful future, so excellently encapsulated by Wythenshawe and the Garden City movement. Let us add into that context the consumer. We already know that so much of agricultural work has now been captured by the food processing industry, who make demands on crop and variety, with implications for the dangers of monocropping, which Matt also mentioned, and biodiversity. But the story of how we get to there will take in processing technologies, distribution networks, and indeed the gloriously happy Wythenshawe housewife, here taste testing. So this isn't actually Wythenshawe, but you can place her directly there. I do have another, which I also enjoy. And so these photos aren't dated, but they're at the NIAB archive. A photograph prepared for an exhibit on potato quality, demonstrating that the reaction of the housewife is not forgotten in the testing programme. So, if we ask what is the UK environment for, faced by this kind of photo, it is to produce potatoes that taste delicious, but are also easier for a woman to peel. So gender has not yet featured all that much in what we talked about today, but by following the potatoes wherever they lead, and recognising them as technical objects, which, in this case, out to make a woman's life easier in sports Karen mode, we can fill up the techno-environmental past with everything that we need to know in the present. And with that, I'd just like to thank you.